everybody. As you know, we are studying how to interpret the Bible, and in the last video we studied about different ways that we instinctively use to study the Bible. We will complete the study of principles in live sessions when we'll be together by studying two other principles: the progressive revelation of God, how God reveals himself through the Bible, and we'll get deeper in the actualization model I briefly talked about at the end of the last video. Now we're gonna study the tools that we need for a good spiritual analysis of the biblical text. The first one is coming from the scientific studies I talked about in the beginning of the last video, but it is still essential, and if we don't want to make the Bible say what it doesn't say, we will need to study the literary genres. To understand how important is the concept of literary genre, we will begin with an example. At the end of this lesson, you will be familiar with the concept of literary genre, and this double word literary genre will be repeated hundreds of times. So let's begin with the first example.
Indeed, they sow the wind and reap the whirlwind. There is no standing grain. What sprouts fails to yield flour. Even if they did, foreigners would swallow it up. Israel is swallowed up. Now they are among the nations like discarded pottery. For they have gone up to Assyria, like a wild donkey going off on its own. Ephraim has paid for love. Even though they hire lovers among the nations, I will now round them up, and they will begin to decrease in number, under the burden of the king and leaders.
You find this text in Hosea 8, 7, 10. The second text is this one.
In the 52nd year of Judah's king Azariah, Pekah son of Remaliah became king over Israel in Samaria, and he reigned 20 years. He did what was evil in the Lord's sight. He did not turn away from the sins Jeroboam son of Nebat had caused Israel to commit. In the days of King Pekah of Israel, King Tiglath-Pileser of Assyria came and captured Ijon, Abel-Beth-Maachah, Genoa, Kedesh, Hazar, Gilead, and Galilee, all the land of Naphtali, and deported the people to Assyria.
You can find this text in 2 Kings chapter 15 verse 27 to 29, and actually those two texts, as different as they seem to be from one another, are talking about the same historical event, the deportation of the people of the northern tribes of Israel in Assyria. The first text is prophetic. The second text is narrative. Those two texts have two different genres, but they talk about the same historic event. It seems obvious that the literary genre is important, but sometimes we forget and fall in exegetical and hermeneutical traps because we neglect to study the genres. So, what is a literary genre? Genre means type or kind of. So, literary genres are different kinds of literature. A genre contains three characteristics: style, situation, intention. You don't have to remember this, but it is to show you how we can distinguish between the genres. Even if we are not scholars, as Bible readers, we should be able to recognize the genre we are reading. Jews in the first century did not have the tools we have, but they instinctively knew how to make the difference between genres. The aim of that is to know what we can say from a text and what we cannot say. There are 10 genres that we should be aware of. Of course, there are many more, and each genre that we will study in this video can be divided in sub-genre. But for us, with a spiritual purpose, it is enough to know those 10 genres. So here is a simplified list with their characteristics. The narrative genre, gospel, parable, preaching, laws, prophecy, apocalyptic, poetry, wisdom, epistles. You have heard all those words at some time when hearing sermons or lessons about Bible. But here it's more formal, more organized. This table should help you to recognize the genres in the Bible. Now we will review them one by one, trying to understand what to do when we have identified the genre we are reading. So I will take all the ranks of this table and I will detail it and show you with examples how to use the text that fits in the description that we have. Each genre can be divided in subgenre. For example, the prophetic genre can be subdivided into an oracle of judgment or a vision or a prophetic gesture, like when the prophet Hosea has to marry with a prostitute to show the relationship that Israel has with his God. It can also be vocation narratives, like when Isaiah or Jeremiah are called by God. So you can see that here we have a list that is not complete, but it will be sufficient to identify the genre and have the good attitude, the right attitude with the texts you are reading in the Bible. Let's start with the first genre that you can see on this slide, the narrative genre. So the narrative constitutes 40% of the Old Testament. The book of Acts also is classified in narratives. The Gospels are not classified in narratives, even if they are narratives, but they have special characteristics that made of them a genre in themselves. Always remember that the Bible is an integrated overall story. The story of the Bible is the story of the relationship between God and creation, and especially in creation with man. It's a meta-narrative, which means that it's a story going through the little stories you can find in the Bible. It's the story of salvation also, and the literary genre of narration is the skeleton of the meta-narrative. It's thanks to the narratives that we can build a meta-narrative, an overall story of God's interacting with man. The goal of narratives is to show that God is regularly acting in human history. It's not to show how God is acting, because actually, if you study in details what happened in God interacting with people, he doesn't act the same way in yet similar situations. So you can't say how God is acting. You can't predict how God will act in a situation just because you've read a story that tells you that God acted this way. Sometimes you have to be careful that in other similar situations God acted completely differently. So the goal is not to show how God is acting, but to show that He is acting in human history. Also, the goal is to show that God acts with and in spite of humans. God is involved in human history and in the creation. Something you have to be careful of when you read the Bible, and especially in narratives, is that you can switch from a genre to another one. For example, the law of Moses is inserted in the narrative of Exodus. In Exodus 20, you have the law that is given, and you have the circumstances in which the law was given to Moses. The circumstances are a narrative, but the law in itself is inserted in the narrative, but it's another literary genre. So you have to be careful that when you read a story, sometimes you can switch to another genre. Another example of that is the parable of the rich that takes the poor little lamb in 2 Samuel 12, when Nathan goes to King David to tell him the story to make him react against his own sin. Another way to switch from a genre to another can be from narrative to apocalyptic. In the book of Daniel, we find some apocalyptic material inserted in the narrative of Daniel. Daniel is living extraordinary things with God in very hard moment in Babylon. So when you use a narrative to preach or to teach or to use as an example when you're doing biblical counseling, you should never use a narrative without making links to other texts of other genera. You should always try to understand the Old Testament narratives with Jesus in mind. In the same way, don't study a narrative without thinking of the whole biblical story from creation to Christ and the church. You have to put your analysis of the text into the context of the whole Bible, the whole story of the Bible. So you need to study the historiographic context, which means that you need to find in which period of the biblical overall story is this text situated. For example, you cannot understand Genesis 37, 5 to 11 when Joseph is telling his vision about the stars without knowing Genesis 42, verse 6, his brothers bowing down before him, and without making the link with Jesus also. I won't do that now because I don't have time, but always link the narratives in the meta-narrative and with Jesus. When you read a narrative, never try to find a hidden meaning in the story. Try to find what the authors wanted hearers to understand through the story. Why was this story written? For example, you should never analyze Genesis 1, 2, 3 with scientific arguments because it's not a scientific text. So don't try to analyze Genesis 1 and 2 with scientific arguments because they don't fit in the story. Also, don't try to allegorize stories because they are not made for that. Also, one of the most important things is to avoid to build a doctrine or a moral or a theology with a narrative alone without making links with the global biblical story and other genres and also with Jesus' spirit, which means Jesus' way of acting, way of preaching, way of teaching, and with the cross. For example, if you try to use 1 Samuel 20 verse 17 and verse 41 to prove that homosexuality is approved by God, then you are in a wrong use of narratives. And if you try to use 2 Chronicles chapter 7 verse 14 to 16 to say that the Jerusalem temple should be rebuilt, then you go against John chapter 2 verse 13 to 22. So you go against Jesus' teaching and then your interpretation is false. So narratives are very interesting, but they should never be used alone. There is another kind of narratives in the Bible which is called the gospel. The gospel is still telling story, but as the narratives in the Old Testament were about God interacting with man and with his people or with creation. Here we have Jesus, incarnated God, amongst men, amongst his people, preaching and teaching and dying on a cross. And the gospel documents are the narrative of this special time of interaction between God and people. So it's a different genre. This genre was invented by Mark as a special type of narrative whose aim is to preach Jesus. Jesus is God, but the way of interacting is different because it's God amongst men. So with the gospel, there are some precautions to take. For example, don't confuse gospel and gospel. The gospel with a big J is the good news. The gospel with a small j is a text, a genre, which bear a testimony about the big gospel. Remember that a gospel is a way to preach about the gospel. Every word, every paragraph, everything in the gospel must be interpreted. Be careful also not to consider that the gospels are history. Each one of the 4 gospels is a preaching of Jesus to a special church or a special person. You can see that in Luke 1 verse 1. when Luke says that he's writing to Theophilus. Luke is telling us that he's composing a story with testimonies about Jesus. Also, you can understand the difference between gospel and gospel through Romans 1 verse 1 to 4. It's not history in the way we understand history as historical science. Gospels are not necessarily chronological. Doesn't mean that it did not happen, but it means that it has not the same significance as a story written by an historian of the 21st century. The Gospels are a testimony. It's a testimony about Jesus, the testimony about the way, about life, about the truth. For example, John 20 verse 30 to 31 says, "Why was written the Gospel of John? So that we believe, not so that we are instructed about what happened." Even if we are instructed about what happened, but it's not the goal. If you study carefully Matthew's structure, you would see that Matthew has built his gospel to make it the proof that Jesus was the new Moses and that he gave a new law, and that the law of Moses has been replaced by the law of Jesus, which is of a different nature. In every good commentaries, you can see how the Sermon of the Mount is built on a structure that make links to the 5 books of the Torah. One of the precautions you have to take when you study the Gospel is to be able to know or to find in commentaries the context of the writers and the context of the hearers. The relationship between writers and hearers will help you to understand why the Gospel was written, and it will influence the way you see what is written. Remember that a Gospel is written to preach at a specific time for a specific need. For example, Matthew 12 verse 1 to 8 shows that mercy is more important than religiosity. And Jesus says he's more than Sabbath or the temple. He even replaces the Sabbath and the temple. And such claim from Jesus is revolutionary for Jews. And Matthew, as I told you, wrote so that people can be aware that the new Moses has come. The prophet that was announced by Moses himself in Deuteronomy 18 is Jesus, and that everything is new now with Jesus. So this is because it was written to a Greek and Jew community so that they can understand this. If Matthew was written to Gentiles, they would have missed the point. Do not forget that the Gospels were written after the letters of Paul, and it's even more important to remember that when you study the letters of Paul. But remember that Mark was written between 65 to 70, which means before the destruction of Jerusalem in 70. But the 3 other Gospels that used Mark, not John, but Matthew and Luke used Mark to write their own gospel and to direct it to their community, to adapt Mark's story to their church. And they were written between 80 and 95. For example, Matthew and Luke are very often dated from 80 to 85, and John around the year 95. But Paul is writing very earlier, between the year 50, and sometimes some scholars date 1 Thessalonians or Galatians from earlier than 50. But the consensus is that Paul wrote between 50 and 64. Think about those details to give you clues of what is going on in the text you're reading. Very often inside narratives, and even more inside Gospels, you have the parables. So what is a parable? A parable is a little fictive story based on everyday life, to think about spiritual life, to make a link between everyday life and spiritual life. And very often, at least in the Gospels, parables are about the kingdom of God. Most often, it has one main meaning, which should never be forgotten. This meaning is found by determining what is surprising or even shocking in the story. So, how to use a parable? The first thing not to do is to allegorize the parable. It's so easy to fall in this trap because the parable itself is already an allegory of the spiritual life. You don't have to add an allegory to the allegory, which would drive you too far from the real meaning. So what you have to do is to find the global meaning by determining who is the central character. Also, don't use a parable alone to determine a doctrine, but now you're used to this warning not to determine a doctrine from a single text of a single literary genre. Use a parable to support a doctrine, not to establish it. Don't explain a parable without the social context of the time. And one of the things that you should do when you find that you are reading the literary genre parable is to look for what is shocking for the hearers of that time. Very often we are not shocked because we are used to many features that come out of the parable. But for a first century reader, it would be shocking. And I will give you an example. But you can try to find what would create the same shock today in our social context. For example, the parable that we call the parable of the prodigal son. Hearers of this parable in the first century would have been shocked by the attitude of the father. The father is the central character, and they would have been shocked by the attitude of the son. But what is even more shocking for a first century era is the attitude of the father, who is not correcting his son. That was shocking for the ancient Near East social context. It is spiritually shocking as it tells that God is weak when his true power is in his love and not in his honor. God is more concerned about love than about honor. And for a first century man of any religion, it would be shocking to hear that love is the value that surpasses honor. And you can say that love is surpassing honor because you can find, for example, in 1 Corinthians 13, verse 13, the exact meaning of that. That love is the greatest of all the values that we need. I can use another example, the parable of the Good Samaritan. For us, if we don't know who was a Samaritan for a first century Jew of Jerusalem, we don't realize the shock. A Samaritan was an heretic. He was a foreigner. He was someone of another religion, a close religion, but another one, like, for example, for us, Muslims. So in our social context, in our churches, we could use the example of Muslims doing better good than Christians. We would be shocked by hearing such a story. But that's the kind of story Jesus was telling to his first century hearers. Or I could tell you a story of an homosexual guy who has a better empathy or is doing much more good deeds than lots of Christians. We would be shocked and we would be forced to recognize that we missed something in our relationship with God. And that was what Jesus was doing in the first century, to shock people so that they would react. No one could be indifferent to Jesus' parable because it was shocking. So as we try to understand and analyze a parable, we need to find this shocking point that Jesus is doing. I told you there were many parables in the Gospels about God's kingdom. So for kingdom parable, be careful with the wording. They very often begin by, the kingdom of heaven is like this or that, or this man or this thing. You should prefer translations saying, for example, the kingdom of heaven may be compared to. Read different translations of parables and you will have a different taste of what it says. And when it says that the kingdom of heaven is like, it doesn't mean that the kingdom of heaven is a man or is a coin or is a sheep. No, the kingdom is compared to this story. In the kingdom of heaven, what happens is like what happens in this story. In Matthew 13:24, literally, we read that the kingdom of the heaven has been made like a man who, having sown good seeds in the field of him. We should understand things happen in the kingdom as when a man have sown good seeds in his field. And so we understand the image that Jesus wants to give about the kingdom of heaven. And still, there may be some shocking points through kingdom parables. The next genre that we are going to study is called sermons. We could use the technical term homiletics, which means preaching. Sermons are inserted here and there through the text of the Bible. You can find sermons in a lot of places in the Bible. So how to determine that we are reading a text that is a sermon or a preaching? Very often it is directed to crowds or the representatives of a crowd, and the intention is a direct preaching. For example, you have in the Gospel of Matthew 5 speeches of Jesus that can be called sermons or preaching. The one we know the best is the Sermon on the Mount, but there are 4 others that are even structuring the whole Gospel. In John, you have the chapters 13 to 16 that are preaching. And there, Jesus is talking with the disciples who represents the whole church. Speeches in Acts are numerous. Peter in Acts 2, but also Paul preach, and even James in Acts 15 is preaching. The whole epistle of James is a sermon. It's written for churches. Then you can see that sermons are everywhere in the New Testament. You can find some in the Old Testament too. There are things to take into account, to keep in mind when we read sermons and when we want to use sermons of the Bible to preach for today. Because you can't take a sermon from the Bible and preach it directly to people today, because you have some precautions to take. The first one is do not take sentences out of the context. Try to understand the whole sermon structure and the goal of the sermon before you use a part of it or a quotation of it. It's very important to have in mind what was the goal of the author of the sermon. For example, in the book of James, the goal is to show how to resist the devil. The goal is to establish how to live a life of resistance. Also, do not forget the recipients of the sermon, to whom it is directed. If it is inserted in a narrative, there may be 2 kinds of recipients, 2 kinds of people to whom it was preached. First, the people who are named in the narrative, for example, the crowd on the hill for the Sermon of the Mount. But also, it can be directed to the reader, because the Sermon of the Mount, for example, has been put in a form that could be written, and when you read carefully, you can understand that the Sermon of the Mount was not just a preaching one day on a hill, but it's the summary of the whole teaching of Jesus to the church. So that's important to know to whom it is directed explicitly, but also through the document you're reading in the Bible. For example, the Sermon of the Mount is given to the church, not just to the people on the hill, and it's given to help the church live in a difficult time of persecutions by the Jews, when Christians were rejected from the synagogues. And the whole Gospel of Matthew is written to help the church endure this time when they were going to the synagogue and the Jews would reject them and say, "You're not Jew because you believe in Jesus. You're not Jew anymore. You can't stay in the synagogue with us." And this separation was painful because the first Christian, and especially the Christians hearing or reading the Gospel of Matthew, were themselves true and real Jews, believing in Jesus, but still Jews. So they were rejected by their own brothers and by their spiritual and religious family. And the Sermon of the Mount is there to encourage them, first to understand what's happening, and second to have the right tools to react to violence without being violent. And also, it is important to understand why is this sermon inserted here in the book you're reading. For example, the Sermon of the Mount. Why is it in chapter 5 to 7 and not in chapter 12? There is something going on with the place you find the sermon in the book. Another genre that we find very often in the Bible is law or legal genre. A law is a set of rules established so that the people can live together with God and with one another. In the Old Testament, the 5 first books are called the law. It's the law of Moses. It's called also the Torah, which means the teaching or the law. Very often theologians call them Pentateuch, from Penta in Greek, which means 5, and Tokos, which means book. But most of the Pentateuch, most of the Torah, are narratives. We call them the law because they contain the context in which the law was given. They contain the general law inserted in the narrative, and they show the results of obeying or disobeying the law. Those narratives are about the law, and the story that is counted through those texts emphasize what it brings for someone to obey or to disobey the law. In Matthew 5, verse 18, Jesus said that until heaven and earth pass away, not an iota, not a dot will pass from the law until all is accomplished. This is the English Standard Version. And in Luke 16, verse 16, Jesus said also, the law and the prophets were until John. Since then, the good news of the kingdom of God is preached. So Jesus implies that after John, things are different because things will be accomplished. So the question for us is this one. What in the law is concerning Christians? To answer this question, we have to consider different rules of exegesis, rules of interpretation. For example, don't use laws to fix rules for the church, because after John the Baptist, things are different. And so the law may be used, but in a certain way that Jesus gives us. The law may be used in a certain way through Jesus' teaching and through Jesus' death and resurrection, which made about the law something different. Try to understand what is the intent of the law, what is behind, why was it given in the context of the narrative where you find this law. For example, if you read Deuteronomy chapter 22, verse 8, you can read, if you build a new house, make a railing around your roof so that you don't bring blood guilt on your house if someone falls from it. The question is, as Christians, when we build a house, do we have to make a flat roof and put a rail around it? Is it a prescription necessary to be in the obedience of God? I take this simple example because it's easy to understand that, of course not. It's contextual. In the ancient Near East, roofs were flat. They were used as a patio. And so it was used for everyday life. Another example, if you read Matthew 5 from verse 21 to 48, you will see that very often Jesus said, you've heard it has been said, but I tell you something different, or something that goes even beyond what you've heard before. You have 6 antitheses, what we call antitheses. It means that Jesus tells us something that is quite different from what Jews had heard before from the Torah. So Jesus is making the Torah something different. He doesn't abolish it. He takes it as a starting point and goes beyond, trying to find what is the intent of the law, what was the original goal of giving a rule, so that as Christians we don't have to obey the rules, but we have to obey the spirit of the rules. Jesus is there to guide us, not to be legalistic, but to be spiritual. When we cross this genre in our reading of the Bible, we need to find what laws were kept by Christians in the New Testament and try to understand why they kept these laws and why they abandoned some others. For example, if you read Acts 15 in verse 28 to 29, it says, for it was the Holy Spirit's decision and ours not to place further burdens on you beyond these requirements, that you abstain from food offered to idols, from blood, from eating anything that has been strangled, and from sexual immorality. You will do well if you keep yourselves from these things. Farewell. So is the requirement not to eat any blood at all, even for Christians. After this meeting in Jerusalem that is described in Acts 15, Paul did not encourage his churches, the churches he founded himself, to obey the rules given by James. In 1 Corinthians 8, or in Romans 14, for example, he doesn't say that people should abstain from the meat sacrificed to idols. He says that it's a matter of conscience. And he doesn't say that people should abstain from blood. Never we can see that in Paul's letter. And we can even see that Paul's was much more flexible. So what does that mean? That means that this letter, this recommendation given by James during what we call the Council of Jerusalem, those advices were given from the point of view of a church that was constituted by a vast majority of Jews. So what it means is that when Jews are the majority in a church, they should be able to accept non-Jews, at least if they obey not all the Moses law, but the requirements that in the old days were given to non-Jews living in Israel, that we find in Leviticus 17 verse 8, for example. So it means that it's not a rule, it's an advice. And it is an advice given for people living in a certain context. It's not an absolute rule that has to be obeyed everywhere in every time. And even in the reverse case, when Jews were not the majority in the church, they should not impose any law of Moses for a religious purpose. So you see how the context is important to interpret. The next genre we're going to study is prophecy. Prophecy is a speaking from God, and it is very often given in a situation of transgression, which can be conscious or unconscious from the people to whom prophecy is directed to. Prophecy is impressive in the way it expresses. You have visions, gestures, declarations, or oracles. A very well-known exegete of the prophetic genre called Abraham Heschel said, "A prophet is not only a prophet, he is also a poet, a preacher, a patriot, a statesman, a social critic, a moralist." So the style of prophecy is original, sometimes hard to understand and to read for us as 21st century readers. But the content of prophecy is not original. A prophet is a reminder of God's will, of God's way of thinking. A prophet will remind about faith, about love, and he will just be a reminder of something that has already been displayed, in particular by the law. That's why I put the study of this genre just after the law. A prophet is not someone who predicts the future, but he is someone who knows the consequences of obedience and disobedience. Nonetheless, there are prophecies that goes beyond Old Testament times. We call that as Christian messianic prophecies, which means that it talks about the Christ or the Messiah. For example, you have Isaiah 53 that is taken by Christians as being a prophecy about the cross. You have also prophecies that goes beyond Old Testament times that we call eschatologic prophecies that talk about the end of times, not just about the Christ or a Messiah, but the end of times, pointing out to church time, for example, in 1 Corinthians 10 verse 11 or Hebrews 1 verse 2, or pointing out to the end or the completion of the world, like Ephesians 1 verse 10. So when you face this literary genre, prophetic genre, don't interpret it without the context. I say that for each genre, but the prophecy is always given in a historical and social context. So history and habits of both characters in the narratives and first readers to whom the prophecy is directed. So it's quite important to understand prophecy to get knowledge of the ancient Near East history, its geography and its culture. If you don't have this knowledge, you can't understand prophecies. The good news is that you can find that in many commentaries or in Bible with notes that gives you the elements you need to understand the context. But it still needs a bit of effort, of work to understand the context so that you don't use a prophecy for a wrong purpose. I just give you an example of the context that is needed. For example, Joel chapter 2 verse 20 says, "I will drive the northerner far from you and banish him to a dry and desolate land, his front ranks into the Dead Sea and his rear guard into the Mediterranean Sea. His stench will rise, yes, his rotten smell will rise, for he has done astonishing things." Who is this northerner that the prophet is talking about? Probably it's the Assyrians or the Babylonians. It depends because we don't know really at what time was written this prophecy of Joel. But if you understand the geography, if you have a look on a map of the ancient Near East, you understand why the people in Israel would say the enemy from the north or the northerners, because people from Mesopotamia would have to go around the Arabic desert. And so when they arrive in the country, they would come from the north, even if Mesopotamia was more on the east or the northeast. So you see, that's important to know these kind of little details you can find in commentaries or study Bible with introductions to each book. They are there to help us not to be lost in the text or not to use it in a bad way. Another precaution to take with prophecy is to avoid to make links between Old Testament prophecies and New Testament events if New Testament writers have not done it themselves. This is called typology, and we already talked about that, but we need to relate prophecy to historical events or to narratives and to New Testament if it is explicitly made in the New Testament itself. I gave you here the example of Deuteronomy 28, where you have the curses for disobedience or the blessings for obedience, which are written at the end of the second giving of the law in the Deuteronomy. But we have to be careful not to take that literally unless the New Testament does it itself. And even in this case, we have to actualize those principles so that we can think about them in our context. For example, I can give you the links that the New Testament made with Old Testament prophecies. Isaiah 7 verse 14 is talking about Emmanuel, and Matthew is using this term Emmanuel to tell us something about the presence of God amongst his people in chapter 1, verse 22-23. Hosea 11, verse 1, about the child called out of Egypt, is a prophecy used by Matthew in chapter 2, verse 15. And there are many more. For example, Jeremiah 31, verse 15 is used in Matthew chapter 2, verse 17 to 18. Zechariah 9, verse 9 is used in John 12, verse 15. And Exodus 17, 1 to 7 with Numbers 21 to 13 is used in 1 Corinthians 10, verse 4, etc., etc. There are so many prophecies that are used in the New Testament coming from the Old Testament. But this is an authorized way of using them that we call typology, and that is a highly risky process when you use it without the help of the New Testament. When I say no literalism in my slide, I want you to understand that being literalist with prophecy may be easier in trying to interpret, but it will lead you to some problems. But if you make the effort to know what are the principles that you can find in prophecies that are confirmed by Jesus, who was the highest prophet, then you will end up with a better interpretation. And also, don't think that prophecy is for the future. Most of the time when a prophet is prophesying for his hero's future, some immediate future, some near future, not some 2000 or 3000 year ahead future. Most of the time, if the prophecy concerns an immediate future, for us, it is in our past. It's in the prophet's future, but in our past. So prophecy is maybe one of the hardest genre to use for Bible interpretation and for finding principles for our lives to be put in practice. The next genre we're gonna study is an evolution of the prophetic genre. It's the apocalyptic literature. In Revelation chapter 1 verse 1, the book begins by Apocalypsis Jesu Christu, which means revelation of Jesus Christ. But apocalyptic literature is not only in the book of Revelation. You find this genre in Luke chapter 2 verse 34-35, for example, or 2 Thessalonians chapter 2 verse 7 to 12, or the chapter 24 of Matthew and the chapter 21 of Luke. And in the Old Testament also you have this kind of literature. like Isaiah chapter 24 to 27, Isaiah chapter 34 to, and Zechariah chapter 13 to 14, or Joel chapter 3 to 4, and especially in Daniel chapter 7 and 8. There are also lots of non-biblical apocalyptic books, like 1st Enoch, 4th Esdras, 2nd Baruch, Revelation of Abraham, Assumption of Moses, and many more, which are Jewish apocalyptic books. So what are the characteristics of an apocalyptic speech? First, the text is a revelation to a human of an unearthly reality, a reality from above, from heaven, through an intermediary that uses symbols. This is the official definition of apocalyptic speech, a revelation to a human of an unearthly reality through an intermediary that uses symbols. The text is always referring to a time of crisis, resulting from a long story, but the crisis is not the end. It's just a time that the believers has to go through. It's also put in a space. The reality of the world in apocalyptic literature is symbolized by two floors, heaven and earth. And what happens in our lower world is the image of what is happening in heavens. There is also a typical content in apocalyptic literature. Apocalyptic writers question the origin of evil. So you should always remember something very, very, very important about apocalyptic literature. First, the objective of an apocalyptic writer is always to encourage people in time of crisis, like persecutions, and to tell them that God is in control and that they can trust Him. Look at Isaiah 24, verse 4 to 6, for example. Apocalyptic literature calls to emotions, and even to more than emotions, they call to astonishment of the reader. And the second thing to remember is that an apocalyptic writer have as an objective to encourage but never to predict long time future. They always want to predict what will happen soon through God's action. You just have to look to the first verse of Revelation that says that the revelation of Jesus Christ that God gave him to show his servants what must soon take place. So it's not for a 2000 ahead future, it is for soon. So now you've been introduced to those characteristics of the apocalyptic literature. What should we do? As usual, no literalism. Recognize first the symbols, and for that you will need a good commentary. And when I say a good commentary, I mean a commentary that will not lead you to interpret today's events in the light of first century apocalyptic literature. If you try to find a direct meaning for today, you will go into a bad interpretation. You need to find the historical circumstances in which the text was written. If a commentary makes links with today's events, burn it and never go back to it. Remember that apocalyptic literature corresponds to times of crisis. Remember that the twofold layers of reality that apocalyptic literature displays is not necessarily to be taken literally. For example, George Bush in 2003 referred to Ezekiel 38 and 39 and Revelations 20 verse 8 to justify his military intervention in Iraq. This is bad interpretation of the Bible. When you interpret the Bible, whatever genre you are reading or interpreting, don't forget that the summit of time is Christ. We are not the most important people in history. There will be people after us, and there were people before us. Try to find in which way Christ is announced, not what we are living is announced. For example, if you read Daniel chapter 7, verse 27, if you have Christ in mind, you will understand very easily what it is talking about. Next genre we're going to study, poetry. This is quite different from prophecy and apocalyptic, even if sometimes we can find poetry in prophecy. Poetry is a massive genre in the Bible. Psalms, Song of Songs, Jeremiah chapter 1 to 25, Lamentations, the book of Job, Genesis chapter 1, etc. There are so many texts that are poetry in the Bible. Those texts were written to be easy to learn and to inspire emotions. When you read poetry through the Bible, you can feel joy, you can feel sadness, you can feel disappointment, you can feel thankfulness, all those feelings that we also experiment in our lives today. That's why it is so fantastic to read poetry through the Bible, because we can share with people of several centuries ago the same kind of spiritual feelings. Some of its poetry was written to be sung. We'll see that in a few seconds with an example with Jesus. The problem with poetry is that translation loses a lot of the poetic details, like syntax, word games, rhythm, alliterations, consonances, repetitions, and parallelisms, metaphors, and also acrostics, which are kinds of rhymes but at the beginning of the verse and not at the end. In the Western society, we feel poetry when we hear rhymes. But for an Hebrew era or for an Hebrew singer, acrostics were even more popular than rhymes. So, what to do with those texts? What to do with poetry when we find it in the Bible? As usual, no literalism. If you don't think that rivers clap their hands, then you can't use other texts for literalism. You have to check, you have to weigh the possibility of literalism when you read a poetic text. You should be able to recognize allegories and images that are used by authors of poetry. And the most important, I think, is to identify emotions and their evolution through the text, and especially the Psalms, that very often begin with a sad attitude and finish with joy, because there is a metamorphosis coming through the evolution of the Psalm. Also, don't forget that Psalms are not words from God, but they are words for God. They are a help to know how to pray honestly to God. We can follow the example of the psalmist that prays wholeheartedly and very honestly. Psalms can be used also for worship. Jesus himself used psalms just before going to his execution. At the end of the first Lord's Supper that ever occurred on this earth, Jesus sang with his disciples Psalms 113 and to 118 and the Psalm 136. And those psalms were called the Hallel psalms because you have the repetition of the word Alleluia or Alleluia, which means praise God. James, in his letter, also suggests that we use psalms for personal worship. He said psaletto, which means singing psalms, in chapter 5, verse 13. And Paul suggests the same, that we use psalms for church worship, like in Ephesians 5:19 or Colossians 3:16. So psalms are very precious because they help us to worship God. In the book of Job, which is more a mix between wisdom and poetry, we have to be careful not to take as truth all what Job's friends say, and even sometimes Job's words are misleading. We have to recognize that Job is a subversive theological book for its time. And here we need to find truth and principles by comparing what is taught in the book of Job with what Jesus would have taught. If you read, for example, Job chapter 8, verse 3 to 4, it says,
Does God pervert justice? Does the Almighty pervert what is right? Since your children sinned against him, he gave them over to their rebellion.
Does God pervert justice? Everyone would say no. Does the Almighty pervert what is right? Everyone would say no. But the answer that the writer put in the mouth of Bildad is far away from what Jesus taught. For example, in John chapter 9, when he meets this blind guy, he says that neither him nor his parents were sinners. And you have the same kind of teaching in Luke 13, verse 1 to 5, when Jesus talked about those Galileans whose blood Pilate had mixed with their sacrifices, or those 18 people that the tower in Siloam fell on and killed. And Jesus says that they were not more sinful than any other people on this earth. So we have to be careful, not only with poetry, but with all teachings that can lead us away from Jesus. But in poetry, we can have this kind of problems, especially with Proverbs, with Psalms, or with the book of Job, where emotions, where feelings are expressed, but which does not correspond to truth. It corresponds to what the heart of the people felt, but not to the truth that Jesus would teach later. And now we're gonna jump to the next genre, which is wisdom. A lot of what is classified in poetry can also be considered as wisdom. We've talked about the book of Job. It can be classified in both genres. Proverbs also can be put in wisdom literature. Ecclesiastes, some Psalms too, are in wisdom literature. This genre can be a trap for interpretation because it can lead to understand the contrary of what it really teaches, or the contrary of what Jesus teaches. So we have to be careful not to isolate sentences without being sure of the context, which is essentially literary and quite independent from history, because sometimes wisdom through reasoning expresses what we should not think. And especially in Job, in the mouth of his friends expressed a bad theology, and the author did it on purpose so that Job could answer and express his innocence, express that there is something wrong in what his friends were thinking. And we can guess that what Job's friends were expressing was the main theology, the dominating theology at the time the book was written, so that it is a very subversive book. So be careful not to isolate sentences from the context, and especially the literary context. What you have to do is to know the structure of wisdom books. That will help you to understand how the reasoning is progressing throughout the book. If, for example, you isolate Ecclesiastes chapter 1 verse 14, which says,
I have seen all the things that are done under the sun, and have found everything to be futile, a pursuit of the wind.
At first glance, you could think it says that nothing can be done because everything is futile. But in fact, if you put it in the context of the chapter, it means that without God, life has no meaning nor purpose. So you see, isolating a sentence from wisdom literature is even worse from isolating any sentence in other genres. Job or Ecclesiastes are essentially asking why, if God is sovereign, then there is no righteousness between humans. For Job, God is too much present, and in Ecclesiastes, God is too far. You have to study the whole structure, the whole book, to understand the general way of reasoning of the authors when they wrote their text. Concerning Proverbs, as usual, do not literalize. Don't fall into literalism. Proverb in Hebrew means parabolic truth. So proverbs are not rules, nor commandments, nor promises, nor absolute truth, but relative truth. Proverbs are not laws of the universe. They are in general commentaries on life, and they describe tendencies. They tell us here is how life usually works, which imply also that it's not always the case, but very often you can observe that it's going this way. So you have to be careful not to take Proverbs literally. For example, Proverb 12 verse 21, which says,
No disaster overcomes the righteous, but the wicked are full of misery.
If you take it literally, then you can think that every people who are rich, who live in a nice house, have a nice family, they may be righteous. But those who are poor, who got illness, whose family are not so well, then you can call them wicked. Is that right? Is that what we really observe? You can read also the Psalm 73, verse 3 to 5, which says something like the contrary.
For I envied the arrogant. I saw the prosperity of the wicked. They have an easy time until they die, and their bodies are well fed. They are not in trouble like others. They are not afflicted like most people.
So you see, the goal is not to take it literally, but to interpret. And also, if you make the link with Jesus, if you try to understand Jesus' wisdom, you will discover that for him, being poor is not a bad thing. For him, being ill is not a curse from God. For him, being elevated means going to the cross. So you see, Jesus will help us have the true wisdom, and every proverb should fit in Jesus' wisdom. The wisest man ever was Jesus. So we have to try to understand how Jesus lived wisdom so that we can imitate him. Proverbs can help us only if we put them in the perspective of Jesus' life. Just have a look to Matthew chapter 11, verse 19, where it is said that
The Son of Man came eating and drinking, and they say, Look, a glutton and a drunkard, a friend of tax collectors and sinners. Yet wisdom is vindicated by her deeds.
So you see, Jesus is the wisest man, and it's not always austere. So let's jump now to the last genre we have to study, and you will jump with joy, I think, to the study of epistles. Epistles are letters. Some theologians want to make the difference between a letter and an epistle, but it's not accurate for our purpose, which is to read the Bible spiritually and not scientifically. So epistles can be assimilated to letters, and they are occasional documents, which means that they were written because of and for specific circumstances, either from the writer's or the reader's side. For example, in the book of Romans, Paul is writing for a specific purpose. He wants to encourage the Roman church, but he wants also to ask for help for his mission to Spain. The first purpose is to ask the Roman Church if they can be a base and also a financial support for a mission to Spain. Philemon also is trying to solve a problem, the problem of the relationship between Onesimus, who was a slave, and Philemon, who was his master. The key question when you study an epistle is who is writing, to whom, when, where, why, and what is the purpose of the writing. It's like the 6W rule. You have 6 questions to ask. You can also ask how, and that's exactly what we are doing in studying genres. The genre is part of how was written a document. But when studying the epistles, those 6W questions will help you to find details that are so much important for the interpretation. So what to do and what not to do when you study epistles. First, don't think that a letter has been written to you, even if it's through the Spirit, because sometimes a situation described can look like a situation we live, but there are still many differences that are necessary to identify, and especially context differences. The first thing you need to do if you want to assimilate your situation to the situation of the recipients is to find who they were, to whom was written this epistle, and what were the characteristics of those people who were supposed to hear this epistle. When Paul in his letter to the Romans writes that Jesus is Son of God, we should remember that this title was normally used for the emperor. And by writing this, Paul is subversive, and he is even writing that in a letter to people who live in the capital of the empire. But also we have to remember that this title, Son of God, had not the same meaning for people who were Jews and for people who were Roman citizens. for a Roman citizen to hear this title attributed to Jesus and not to the emperor, that was revolutionary. That was shocking. And that was very pleasing too, to remember that the true emperor is Jesus. We, as 21st century readers, when we hear that Jesus was the Son of God, we are quite used to that. Even if we were former atheists, we are used to know that Christians called Jesus the Son of God. So the feeling and the meaning for us are not the same as for the first century recipients. So if we want to relate to those people in Rome who first read this letter, we have to be careful of those differences of feeling, of understanding of some words that has not the same meaning today and by the time. So don't think a letter was written to you. But in the same way, don't think that a letter was written for you. Identify the reason why the author wrote this letter. What kind of need does he want to fulfill? What kind of problem does he want to solve? For example, and I keep the example of the letter to the Romans, Paul mainly wrote to prepare his trip in Rome and to ask for help to go to Spain. He openly tells them what are his convictions so that they won't be surprised if he comes to Rome with this kind of gospel he is proclaiming everywhere from Jerusalem to Rome. So you understand, the letter to the Romans was written to the Romans, not to you, not for you. Of course, you can say that it was written for you through the will of the Spirit, but it's not as if you were the recipient of the letter. You're the recipient through the centuries only if you interpret it correctly. Also, we should never forget that a passage is a part of a larger letter. So we need to identify how the passage we are reading is integrated into a much larger process of reasoning. If I still use the letter to the Romans as an example, if you read chapter 1, verse 18 to 32, without reading until chapter 4, you can interpret badly what Paul says about the wrath of God. If you don't read the wrath of God into the larger context of all what Paul says until chapter 4, then you can conclude that God is angry at man. But it's not what Paul wants to say. The wrath of God is just a starting point for his argumentation. But at the end, it is the grace that is free. And that is the true description of God. It's not that he's angry. It is that is full of grace and love and patience for us, even if we are sinners. So you see, we need to put any idea we find in the letter in the larger argumentation of the author so that we don't miss what he really wants to say. And finally, to be brief, we have to be careful about some techniques that are used by authors to make their point. For example, sometimes you can have reasoning by absurd, like in Romans 3, chapter 7, where Paul is using rhetorical absurd questions, like, if I lie much, then God's glory will be more revealed because I sin more. Identify also rhetorical questions like in 1 Corinthians 12:29, where Paul is asking, is everyone an apostle? Is everyone a prophet? Is everyone a master or a teacher? Of course, the answer is no. And it is part of the building of an argument, of a larger reasoning. There are biblical quotes also everywhere in the New Testament. The New Testament is quoting the Old one. And that's so important to identify how and why authors quote the Old Testament. And very often it is surprising how they use it and how sometimes they make a point from the Old Testament which is not in line with the first meaning of the Old Testament text, but more in line with Jesus' teaching. There are quotes from outside the Bible, like in Jude, verse 14 to 15. You have a quote from 1st Enoch, which is not in the Bible. You have quotes from correspondence also like in 1 Corinthians 7 verse 1, where Paul says that people in Corinth has asked a question to Paul and Paul is now answering it. So you see, there are lots of details and techniques that are used to build a text that will be clues to understand more what the authors meant and what it can mean for us through the Spirit, through the distortion of contexts. To help you to study, if you want to go further or if you want to keep all those details so that you can use them, you can go to this link where I put a summary of everything I say in this video, and you will find all the details and many of the examples I took to show you how functions literary genres. You may have noticed as a conclusion that almost each time I insisted on not being literal and not building a doctrine or a moral or a theology on a specific genre. You need to mix genres so that your doctrine, your convictions can be built not only on one aspect of the Bible, but on many of them. To build convictions, we need to examine the several kinds of biblical literature and determine with all their specificities how to get to biblical principles. So now we're going to try to determine what is the genre of several texts, just as an exercise. Please try to find what is the literary genre of 2 Samuel chapter 12 verse 1 to 4. And now read Daniel 7 verse 1 to 8 and try to find what is the literary genre of this text. And finally, you're lucky I didn't choose 10 examples for the 10 genres that we studied today, but try to find this one, Song of Songs, chapter 2, verse 10 to 13. What is the literary genre of this text? If you had hard time finding those genres, we may make some training when we'll get together in Les Diablerets this summer, but now this video is finished and I hope it helped you to understand the importance of literary genres. And there is still one video to come before we get to live sessions in Les Diablerets. So I wish you the best until the next video. See you soon. Bye bye.